Well, Mr. Representative, thank you very much for joining me.
Hey, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
You bet. Appreciate that. You mind beginning by introducing yourself to the audience and what kind of work you've been up to lately?
Of course. My name is Arturo Alonso. I'm the newly elected representative for House District 89, located in South Oklahoma City. It's the part of town I grew up in, the place I care a lot about. Did that answer your question?
It does.
Awesome.
It's also worth noting you're among the youngest and one of the first Hispanic politicians in the state.
Yeah, so right now I'm the current youngest state legislator we have. So I'm still getting used to being the youngest person in the room. Always, really. I'm the only, I guess, Gen Zer. So I think that's definitely unique to
How old are you,
this legislature. I just turned 24 last week, actually. 24 now. And yeah, one of the few Latinos, the most bilingual legislator we have right now, because I grew up speaking the language and continue with it because my family only really speaks Spanish. I'm a mechanical engineer. I think I might be the first or one of the very few engineers and specifically mechanical engineers that have gone into the legislature. It's not common that engineers, especially young engineers right out of college, get into politics, but I'm excited to be here and contribute in any way I can.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And that is some of the threads you've been pointing at, both the culture diversity and in terms of your background in science. That tends to be one of the themes in your campaign, this idea of more inclusion, of community building and so forth.
Yeah, no, that's been a big focus, and I'm happy that also committee-wise, so we were able to get our committees assigned, and they're also within the areas that I'm interested in. So my committees include government modernization and technology, agriculture, and I'm in two appropriations and budget committees, A&B Health and A&B Energy and Natural Resources.
Fantastic. Do you mind explaining briefly what committees are for folks?
So committees are essentially where whenever bills get introduced, they all get assigned to a specific committee depending on what the bill's about. So if I have a bill, so one of my bills includes emergency medical personnel. So that one's most likely going to be in the health and public health committee. Sometimes, most of the times, it does make sense why a bill got assigned to a specific committee, but sometimes it doesn't. There are certain committees that are kind of just more miscellaneous bills. But in the bill process, once the bill gets filed, like I said, it gets distributed to its specific committee. Then the author presents the bill. There's questions, then there's debate, and then the bill gets voted on whether it passes that committee. And a bill has to pass committee to then get a floor hearing, which the same process repeats in the floor, which is where the legislators, the state representatives in my chamber, same process, like I said, the author presents it, we ask questions, we have debate, sometimes there isn't a debate, it's usually with controversial bills that there is a debate, and then they get voted on. And once it gets out of the floor, the next step is for it to go to the Senate, and then it goes through its own committee and then floor process as well.
Cool. So you began to mention one bill that you've authored so far. Do you mind explaining some more of the other stuff you've been involved with in terms of your short-term goals now that you're in office?
Of course, yeah. So when it comes to short-term goals, the bills that I'm filing for this next legislative session would be within that. The overall theme, I think, of a lot of the bills that I'm presenting is increasing access to many different things. I'm someone that really values just ensuring that people that are in our communities have access to things that the state provides, to different resources, and just making sure that they're thriving as just community members. So I mentioned the EMS personnel bill. That one is essentially granting any licensed personnel through whether they're first responders, like paramedics, emergency medical services personnel. It would enable the state of Oklahoma to be a part of this compact that 22 states are already a part of, and anyone that's licensed in the state or a member state. So if Oklahoma were to become a part of the compact, any first responder through medicine, any medical first responder would be able to practice in any of the other member states. And other states include Kansas, Colorado, Texas, and Louisiana, which are all neighboring states. So for example, if there's a paramedic that's transferring or that's transporting a patient, they can easily transport that patient across state lines. They don't have to get any additional licensure, any additional process to be able to do that, and they don't have to pass it over to a different person. They can, stay with their patient. So it can be beneficial in many ways, increasing access to especially those border towns. So there's that one. Another one that I'm focusing on is increasing language accessibility within medical prescriptions. That one would just ensure that the State Board of Pharmacies adopts rules for limited English proficient patients, so LEP. Because right now in the Board of Pharmacy's rulebook, there isn't anything that deals with ensuring that there is that language access. Typically, pharmacies do have their own systems in place that enable prescriptions to be provided in multiple languages, but there's just no official rule. So it would just ensure that there is language accessibility within medical prescriptions. Because I found that words like once, take once daily, the word once translates to once in Spanish, which is 11. So it can be potentially hazardous to someone if they take 11 doses of a medication compared to one.
Yes.
So
I never thought about that. Yeah, that's a big problem.
Yes, that's a very common word used within the medical prescriptions. So
those two bills, what else have you got?
Yeah, so another one deals with voting access. So increasing the amount of time someone has to vote in person for early voting. So right now, Oklahoma, we have early voting to be Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, and Saturday prior to an election. So mine's it's a small change. Right now, Saturdays voting is from 8 to 2. Every other day it's from 8 to 6. So it would just level it out, making it 8 to 6 on Saturdays as well. Because that's the only day that you can early vote on a weekend. And a lot of times it's hard for people to get out of their job to go vote. So if they don't work Saturdays, it might be easier for them to have access to voting. And I'm putting that one in because one of my district is one of the lowest when it comes to voter turnout. So just finding different ways to make sure they have more access to the polls. That's the purpose behind that bill. And then the last bill deals with the concept of digital citizenship. So ensuring that things like media literacy and digital literacy are taught in our schools. And that would ensure the State Board of Education to implement digital citizenship within their curriculums. And that one, those are the bills, essentially.
It's good stuff, man. Good stuff.
Yeah.
So that's kind of some of the short-term stuff you have going on. What about long-term? When you think about your career as a representative, what do you want your goals to be long-term?
Yeah, and that's definitely a topic that I'm still thinking about a lot because, a year ago I was not thinking about getting into politics, and I didn't know how I would experience it, like whether it's something, like being in it, like, is this something I feel good about doing? Do I enjoy what I'm doing? Do I feel like I am making an impact? Because I decided to run because, for many reasons, I definitely wanted to find ways to serve my community. And I think just in the experience I've had so far, I'm surprised that I've really been enjoying the bill filing process and building relationships. I've been really enjoyed understanding the different processes and just the way the government works, which it can be complicated and it can be a little messy sometimes. But I'm always reminded by people within my community and friends and family that what I'm doing is very impactful. So I think long-term goals would continue doing things within just advocating for more access for people like me, right? Like, I'm a Spanish speaker. I and someone that comes from a humble background, a low-income family, and I think lots of times people like me, it's been hard for us to identify with what goes on in politics and in the government. So increasing access and showing people that the government is for them is going to be a big focus. What that might look like, I'm still kind of developing what that's going to look like and how I'm going to be able to implement that.
So I'm curious on that, and specifically, because one of the themes you've mentioned is more accessibility, more inclusion of the electorate in government. So how, from the flip side, from the perspective of a citizen, what would you say is the most effective way for the average Joe to become involved?
No. So community members, there's a lot that they can do, and there's a lot that I'm really trying to encourage people from my community to do in reaching out and really sharing their opinion on the bills that are being filed. But I'd say one of the most effective things is reaching out and even coming in person to meet their legislator, because a lot of times we will get emails, not a lot of calls, mostly emails, but it's nice to put a face to the person, and really expressing how they feel about a certain piece of legislation. I think is important because it better informs our decisions as legislators. And I'm just one person, and I do believe that we're products of both our experiences and the people we've surrounded ourselves with. And I think if I can better understand how a law might impact someone, it just better informs my decision, because then they can those ideas and those thoughts that have been shared with me are things I'll consider whenever say asking questions. Maybe there's a question that someone might have. So I can ask that question for a constituent. That's a big thing, and community members, they can communicate to legislators. I know one of the most effective ways that I've received messages from community members is email. We will always read it, every email that we find that comes to us. We answer every call. Each legislator is going to have their own approach to these things, but I know since we do focus on increasing access, we do as much as we can to make sure if anything comes up, we always send a reply, and we always kind of address anything that might be included.
Nice. So kind of from a bird's eye view of the country generally, another way that the citizens get involved and let their voice be known is through protest movements. And as it so happens, today we're sitting here in the state capitol. It's a lovely building, beautiful artwork and so forth. But earlier today there was a protest movement. Oklahoma recently became somewhat famous on the national stage once again for fairly restrictive bills. In this particular case, it was certain bills trying to restrict the access of transgender medical procedures and so forth. And it occurs to me actually that this is the second time we've talked on this podcast. The first time we talked was right after the Supreme Court had overturned Roe versus Wade. And Oklahoma famously then too was also seeming to vie for national attention of how restrictive we could get on those sorts of bills. So I guess I would just ask you, what are your general reflections on this particular bill and that sort of move in politics to do these kind of what seem like political stunts at times?
Because there's been many, when it comes to Oklahoma politics, I think a big focus has been to, be the most pro-life state, going back to the decision with Roe v. Wade, and now that that's kind of done with, and we've achieved in being one of the most restrictive when it comes to abortion. Now the next, I guess what it seems like the next thing on the chopping block is gender affirming care. So just finding ways to restrict access to those services. And that is a very controversial and complicated issue. I know it's an issue that I'm going to be focused on really better informing myself in. But I do think it's important, just thinking about the issue as a whole. I'm someone that respects professionals' kind of approaches to it. So I think it's important to give people the liberty and the freedom to kind of make those decisions for themselves. There's certain details when it comes to age and what services are provided depending on how old you are and what can you do on your own versus what you need a parent's permission for. That's something I don't really have too much of an opinion on now. But I do think it's important to really consider experts in the conversation. Medical professionals, I think, is huge, and really better understanding what experiences the families might go through. Because I might try to put myself and be empathetic to the situations. And based off the conversations I've had with parents that might have a child that is considering transitioning, they tend to be very it's a very sensitive topic, and I think even parents sometimes, because it is something new that previous generations haven't really experienced until, I mean, kind of nowadays. It's something that I've noticed families do. They put a lot of care and a lot of focus, and they're very careful with that topic.
Mm-hmm.
So
I definitely appreciate that nuanced position that you want to become more informed, to reflect on this further. But I guess I would ask, as a voter in South Side Oklahoma City, can I count on you to vote against these measures?
Yes, yeah, no, I like I said, I'm going to do as much as I can to better inform my decision. But I think as of now, the way it is, I would vote against restricting gender-affirming care. Going back to just making sure that's a decision that I feel like is more based off of, a family and their medical provider, not so much a politician. And I think lots of times the individuals trying to bring a lot of attention to that issue, it's not, I've just noticed they haven't really considered the true impact it's going to have on those families, those kids, as well as within like the medical procedures going on. So
fantastic. So this is one issue, one specific instance of perhaps what could be characterized as an ethical problem within politics. Last time we had talked, I had mentioned some more general ethical concerns, specifically this was to give folks at home some context. This was before you took office but hadn't won the election. And so some of the issues that I had raised as potential ethical dilemmas you may encounter is, for example, having to ask for money from people that are wealthier than you, having to ask favors from people more powerful than you, perhaps having to make commitments before details are spelled out. I guess I would ask you, number one, is that like a reasonable concern to raise? And number two, if so, how have you been able to address these or handle?
I'd say the reasonable concerns. I don't think I've really dealt with anything that, because I tended to be someone that is connected with my values, and I think integrity is a big thing that I really value. And so far, I guess within my experience, I haven't really dealt with anything that I feel like would be unethical. I try to be very careful with the conversations I have with individuals, because that's one of the things I think about a lot. Like, okay, so is there going to be some kind of back-end deal I'm going to have to make to be able to get a bill passed? Because oftentimes that is the case that happens. I know within our caucus, there's been is someone leaking any information that it should stay within our group? So whether some individuals might have released information to be able to get to a certain position, or to be able to get a certain bill heard. That's not something I've dealt with yet, like I said, but it's something I've kind of just been trying to be observant about. But as those things do come up, I'm always going to try to rely on my values, and that's why a big focus of mine has also been to really understand who I'm working with, and make sure that there's a sense of trust, and a sense of making sure that I surround myself with people that have good intentions. Because at the end of the day, I decided to put my career on pause, give up a fairly good engineering job, not necessarily to just get into a position of power, but to get into a position and to have a platform to really advocate for my community. And I'm going to do that in a way that is ethical and is respectful of my community and the different groups that I'm associating myself with. So I haven't really dealt with anything specific yet that's raised concern for me, like any red flags, but I don't doubt that will come up in the future.
Sure. And so I'm asking from the perspective of somebody outside of politics, as a citizen. And so there's a certain amount that those of us who are not involved in politics just can't know about, kind of the inside baseball within parties. But I suspect there is some pressure from party leadership, especially for young politicians, to have to do a certain amount of fundraising and so forth for the party, and who knows what else. But I guess I would ask you, now that you're on this side of the political spectrum, are there any things that surprised you that going into it you didn't expect to have to encounter?
Well, there's been a lot of things that surprised me, actually, just both within the party and within just government in general, because I was definitely someone that was not as engaged politically, so I didn't really know what I was getting myself into every yeah. So in thinking about anything that might have surprised me within the party, especially when it comes to ethical concerns, there's nothing that I've found that would bring me concern, because in some ways I'm still looking at it from the outside in.
And for folks at home, this is just because session has barely started.
Yeah, session has barely started, so I think there's still some things that I'm yet to experience. We're still in the before session kind of phase. But so far, especially thinking about the party, there isn't anything that's brought up concern to me. There has been, small things like personnel and issues with drama. But there was, I guess, there was, this isn't party related, but there was an individual that had a history of like some fraudulent things that was trying to get involved through campaigns. He's someone I kind of distanced myself from, because he just seemed problematic as well. So like, you know what, that's something I don't even want to risk it, being that I'm just getting started and I still don't really even have a name for myself. That's the only concern I had, but that individual isn't really associated with the party. They were just really trying to get involved with certain campaigns, and I found that years ago that individual they had gotten into jail because they were doing some kind of fraud within misuse of campaign funds. But outside of that, there hasn't really been anything of concern. I know there is fundraising efforts to be able to provide monetary support for future candidates and for future elections. But usually, especially in Oklahoma, there's a lot of ethics involved into who to accept money from, how to accept the money, how much money is accepted, especially with lobbyists. There's limits within that. That's one of the things I was learning a lot about. Just whenever lobbyists, they have a certain cap and amount they can use for dinner or for sponsoring an event. And typically, I think our caucus it seems like they've been doing a good job to follow any ethics regulations. And typically we have an expert, or if not multiple experts, in the ethics rules that the state of Oklahoma has.
So you mentioned some of the caps on funding and donations that can be made, and that's another theme we touched on in our last conversation, how in this country, right, political donations are public knowledge, right? You have to register them officially.
Yes.
Accordingly, our judicial system considers it a form of speech, a form of protected speech. In other words, the money spent in politics sends a message. And you began to allude that you've been careful in this regard, but I guess I'm curious, on a personal level, how have you been handling these big changes, right? Going from engineer guy to politician guy. I can imagine there's some pressure from people that all of a sudden are very interested in you. And so
big time. Yeah, no, it's been a big learning curve, because as an engineer, we tend to be. I know I've always been more of an introvert, so not someone that really got a lot of energy from talking to a lot of people. But throughout campaigning, I really grew in that sense, and it's been kind of cool to see my growth in just interacting with people and being more comfortable just speaking in front of the public as well. That's been a big change. But also, engineers, we tend to be logical, rational. We back up all of our decisions typically with data, statistics, and credible sources. And one thing I've realized in politics that kind of flies out the window. Rationale, good data, all that. It definitely flies out the window sometimes. So it's definitely been interesting to see how people approach, whether it be bills or any kind of political situations. Okay, wait, remind me of your question? I'm sorry.
Well, you're good. No, you're good. I guess the question would be, so we've been, earlier we're focusing on ethical issues, kind of at a bird's eye view of politics, and I guess I'm wondering, you personally, right? Perhaps you've encountered, as you mentioned, that individual that's potentially shady and these sorts of things. So how do you personally kind of balance and say, well, this is good?
Actually, thanks for clarifying that, because I was like, well, let me make sure I'm approaching this in a wide way, because there's definitely been a lot of different interactions I've had with people, and now that I'm getting into the political world, because things like trust and really understanding what agendas people have, because typically, because I'm a state representative, a lot of, out of a sudden I have like 100 new friends because of my position. And typically one thing I've noticed is people, they want to get to know you and they want to, spend some time to sit with you and talk because there's typically an agenda. They have a goal in mind, and a lot of times it's typically it's reasonable and good goal or agenda. Because before I never had an agenda or a goal. I was kind of like, let me just meet this person to meet them. As an engineer, I would meet a person to just better understand their experience as an engineer, just learn from their knowledge. But I think over time I've also developed my own agendas, goals I have. Things like increasing access would be an agenda. Things like finding ways to pass my bills would be an agenda as well. Making relationships. Lots of times, to get to know the person, but knowing that there's also an intent to both help the individual because maybe we align in certain values or in certain issues. So finding ways to help each other. So that's also been a big experience I've had, and just interacting with community members as well that they're involved politically, but sometimes there's people that might want to get to know you because they might not have great intentions. I had an interaction with a few days ago actually with, I met and I had a really good conversation with one individual, and then later on I ran into someone else and they're like, oh, like that person, you need to be careful. So just better understanding that landscape I think is important because so that's been one of the challenges I feel like, because I've always been someone that never had any intentions with meeting people. But now that I am in a position of power, I've noticed that more people have reached out, and sometimes I guess I've started developing ways to better understand where people might be coming from, why they might be wanting to reach out, and not just kind of trying not to be as naive in my interactions with people, because I've always been someone that, even though I was an introvert, I now have grown to be so much more social, and I really enjoy meeting and understanding people and finding ways to support if there's anything I can do for that individual. But I'm just making sure that as I interact with people, I'm interacting with people that do have good intentions in mind.
Yeah. So another major theme of your campaign is very future focused, right? Your campaign starting "Futuro es nuestro," the future is ours. So kind of staying with these this perspective of your personal concerns. You're not currently married, correct?
No, I'm definitely living the single life right now.
So how much thought have you put into the future of marriage and family? Now that you're a politician, obviously this is a very different position, right? Because whatever you do will be public record, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, and it's definitely an area that I'm being careful with because I know my predecessor, he got himself into some trouble because he was messing with a lady that he shouldn't have. And I think because he was also Latino, there's also this perception of myself and he's going to be the same kind of person.
Yeah, we should be very careful about how we phrase it. So yes, the seat you currently occupy was vacated by former Representative Jose Cruz.
Yes.
He has allegations of having sexually assaulted an individual, and so that's what opened up the seat here. As far as I know, the investigation hasn't been.
I haven't really followed what's been going on with that.
I just want to make sure that we're careful about the phrasing here.
No, and thanks for bringing that up, because that's something that, and that's why within that topic I've been just more careful. I'm like, let me not put myself in any position where someone might perceive something and then associate what I'm doing with what's happened before, because he was a young Latino male and I'm a young Latino male, and I realized that sometimes people have like, oh, is he gonna be the same way?
Right.
Because. He's the first Latino that represented House District 89.
And this is one of the kind of concerns that perhaps a viewer right now might raise, right? That it often gets said in the modern political culture that representation matters, right?
Yes.
But it matters to what extent, right? So in former Representative Cruz's case, he was a representative of the Hispanic community of in Southside Oklahoma City, but unfortunately, ultimately, that representation in and of itself was not the best.
Exactly. Yeah. Because and I agree with you. Representation matters, but oftentimes representation isn't justice, so it doesn't bring
the right representation matters.
Exactly, right representation matters, and that's a perception I know I want to kind of change, and that's why when it comes to myself in my dating world. In the dating world, I'm being a little more careful. But I think just in general, even before I decided to get into politics, my goal was always to, if I do decide to get married, which that is in the plans, I won't do it till I get closer to 30 years old. Okay. And that's because even before I decided to get into politics, my goal was to really experience life and really understand and be good with myself, and have a stable job, right? And right now it's very unstable because I'm getting into something that politics, right, which can be demanding in many ways.
Sure. So with the theme of the future focus in mind now, getting out of your personal world and more kind of bird's eye view picture here, what would you say in terms of Oklahoma government should be some of the priorities in terms of a future focused approach?
Yeah, I'd say future focused approach. Oklahoma definitely needs to focus a lot on, I'm just thinking about the demographics of the state. I know, going back to me being Latino, right? The Latino population has grown so much, and I think it's cool that we now have a Mexican consulate, and I think that's going to bring in all sorts of different opportunities for that community. But just better finding ways to understand the diverse communities we have in the state of Oklahoma, and finding ways to move forward and to understand that, you know, we have differences, and I think there is going to be change within what Oklahoma even looks like, what representation looks like in Oklahoma. But as certain communities grow, we need to make sure that the leadership is also reflective of Oklahoma's demographics.
Mm-hmm. So on that note specifically about the importance of leadership and broadening out now to more of a national perspective, I'm curious, I don't know if you've been asked this on camera before, but maybe I'll be the first, but have you considered maybe one day running for president?
Oh, well, that's definitely something I thought of. I was like, you know what, maybe I'll be the first Latino president. Hopefully someone beats me to it. But no, that's definitely something, I think a realistic, that might be a goal I have. Mm-hmm. One of the things going into this, one of the things I thought a lot about is, all right, if I really like it and it's something I feel like I continue to feel passionate about, because I've always had a heart for service. Mm-hmm. Before I thought I was going to be as an engineer. But now that I'm getting into the political world, I realize, I actually enjoy what I'm doing as a state representative. So I think right now, I don't know. I don't want to say no, but I also don't want to say yes. But I think depending on how these next few years go, because I've committed myself to serving a minimum of at least 2 to 3 terms, so 4 to 6 years. And I think based off of my experience and kind of just reflecting on how I feel about what I'm doing, I might decide to, maybe I'll be 12 years as a state representative, or maybe I'll decide to run for something different.
And for folks at home, 12 years is the state limit.
Yes, 12 years is the state limit, so a maximum of 6 terms. But I might even find out that this is something I don't want to do, I don't want to continue with, and I'll just go back into becoming an engineer.
Yeah.
So,
well,
I don't know yet, but I think it's definitely something that I might have in the back of my mind, whether it be something like big like the presidency, but maybe something maybe I decide to find value in a different position, like even if it's something like mayor, city council, even governor, I don't know, but right now I'm definitely going to kind of just experience being a state representative, see how it is for me, and then really reflect on what I want to do moving forward.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, that's a remarkably lucid and honest answer. Most politicians, when they get asked that, they immediately skirt the question and say, I'm focused on this next 2 years or something like that. So that's a remarkably honest answer.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, because I tend to be a very open-minded guy. That's why, with anything really, like, when it comes to food, I'll try anything twice, because maybe I didn't like it the first time, but the second time I might like it.
Yeah.
But that's a similar approach I think I take to a lot of things in life. I'm like, you know what, like, I might not agree with this person, but let me hear them out. And maybe I still don't agree with them, but let me hear them out.
Sure. No, and
at least one more time.
And it's a very important theme. And off camera, you had mentioned that a lot of the work you've been doing in authoring your bills is working across the aisle, directly consulting and asking questions to your Republican colleagues.
Yes.
So on a national level, what do you think Because that seems to be something that's obviously necessary, right? We have a very polarized political climate. What would you say are some of the things that could help that kind of bipartisanship?
Yeah, I think it's just being open to different and diverse perspectives. I think that's the biggest thing. And I think honestly, things like establishing empathy with someone, humanizing an individual, because one thing I've noticed within the political world, both national and state level, we get too caught up in, oh, that guy's a Democrat, so I'm just gonna identify this person as a Democrat, and we're not gonna get along. I don't know. But I think that tends to dehumanize individuals, like rather than seeing them as people, not just, I've noticed some politicians see others as, they're just a Democrat or they're just a Republican. But we're complex beings. We're more than just what we identify politically. And I think we need to just better establish empathy. And that's one of my big goals, just establishing empathy with my colleagues, regardless of whether they're Republican or Democrat. I think lots of times people, I've noticed, they're not used to talking to someone that's Latino. So they might not know how to make a connection, which, I mean, just talk to me like a normal person. But I think it's because they just building that empathy and humanizing ourselves is something that is one of the first steps in establishing dialogue. Because I think we need to focus on building being understanding of others. Because we're not going to agree on everything, and I don't think we should agree on everything.
Sure.
Because to have a good democracy and to have a good governmental systems, we need to have debate, and we need to have arguments to reach what's best for not just one kind of person, to reach what's best for all kinds of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Because it definitely seems to me that so much of national politics tends to just end up being a game of team politics, my team versus your team.
Yeah.
And I definitely don't want to dissuade you from, if you do have ambitions to run for president, but unfortunately the position of the presidency in America has become a real lightning rod of controversy and so forth. Like currently we have our current president and former president both being investigated by special counsels, right? It's just unfortunately not even the first time really that happened. So when Trump first took office, both he and Hillary Clinton were being investigated by the FBI and so forth. So we seem as a country to be plagued with presidents that have criminal investigations done on them and so forth. So in addition to the party politics, it seems that there's some issues with the type of people that run for president that tends to be a lightning rod for political concerns. So going forward, would you plan for avoiding those sorts of pitfalls?
Yeah, I mean, I think just being really focusing on being transparent in many different ways, and I think leaning on people that, I think usually whenever there is an ethical concern that comes up, I know I would feel it in my conscience, and I'm like, you know what, maybe I should talk to someone about this before I move forward. And I think that's important. So I know that's one thing I'll be doing, just before, if I feel like something's like, maybe this isn't right, or maybe I shouldn't be doing this, or I don't know how I feel about this, there's this gut feeling.
Sure.
So consulting people that I think would give me good advice, and good, honest advice that I think would be good for, myself and the situation. Usually I try to communicate the goals I have with people. So just being transparent, being open, and having that accountability, I think, with people that know more than me about these topics is going to be my approach.
Very nice. So I want to return to the future-focused aspect of it. So you are part of, what is the name of the committee? The modernization?
Yeah, government modernization and technology. That was actually my top committee choice.
Okay, fantastic.
Because
so along those lines, one of the big topics, kind of looking at the future of this country, but also the state, the role of artificial intelligence is something that's coming up as a particularly pressing concern, both in terms of practical concerns about job placement, right? If these machines are able to replace and perhaps even do a better job of certain careers that humans have, the sort of job displacement that will happen, that's a political concern, but there gets even broader existential concerns. If we do have an AI that turns against us,
like the Terminator.
And perhaps even worse than the Terminator. Because the Terminator was just one robot, but if you have if you have a full-on Skynet that's able to hack our systems and so forth, And one of the unfortunate things about the concerns with artificial intelligence is there is like a sci-fi element to it. It's fun to think about it in terms of movies and so forth. But what concerns me is that the human concerns, right? The fact that to the extent that human beings are able to get our hands on this tool, right? I think it's reasonable to suspect we'll use it for potentially nefarious purposes, things like warfare, things like cyber hacking, and so forth.
Yeah.
So I guess in terms of your role in the modernization committee, what kind of perspective plans do you have? What kind of things would you like to do in the future to address concerns with artificial intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, I think right now one of the things I'm focused on when it comes to things like AI, artificial intelligence, is just better understanding what technology there even is out there when it comes to AI. I know I've been kind of messing around with ChatGPT just to see how it works and really, one of the things I really try to keep in mind whenever I better understand the technology is a lot of what you mentioned, like how could this impact our society, our communities, the way things just function, the way, I mean, going back to huge questions like what does it mean to be human too? Like, man, because it's I was surprised just how effective that specific AI is. And then there's a lot of questions when it comes to that, because you're right, like some people might not have a job in the future in certain areas. But I think it's one of those things that we just need to build understanding. It's really, really try to understand what the impacts might be, because those are fairly new technologies, and at least on the public side. So I think, at least for me, the big focus is going to be building understanding, because I don't want to rob our, what am I trying to say? I don't want to prevent any huge technological advancements from happening, but I think it's important to be ethical and to really consider how it's going to impact people in society, because at the end of the day, we're still people trying to live our lives.
Yeah. And that's a very important point to make, that there is potentially an upside to this. So most people, and myself certainly included, when we think about artificial intelligence, it tends to be kind of an alarmism, right? That there's dangers here, but it's also true there's potentially huge upsides, right? Things like, if you can have, a kiosk that essentially is able to do the work of a doctor, or, these machines that are already in use where they're able to aid doctors in surgeries and so forth, or even more mundane things. I mean, just something like once we have, drones that are able to deliver pizzas and stuff like that.
Right, or deliver medications to rural communities. That's another thing.
Absolutely. There's so much upside to it that it seems like a travesty to kind of, throw the baby out with the bathwater here.
And actually one thing I did want to mention, because, and I think this one of the reasons why I decided to at least introduce, I don't know how far it's going to get, but the bill that deals with digital citizenship, because digital citizenship is a very broad topic, but it talks about ethics, it talks about safe use of technology, and I think that might be something that we should consider when it comes to how technology advances. What does it mean to be a good digital citizen as we develop and think about technologies? Because you're right, they could be used for very, what's the word, nefarious purposes. But I think ensuring that as we educate, kids and educate ourselves, we're always including aspects to show, like, hey, like, we have a responsibility to be ethical and to be good stewards of the tools that we're creating.
Sure. Yeah, and it's interesting, the concept of digital citizenship. So what we're talking about now is actual human beings that use virtual media and have a presence in that form. But I'm curious about in the future, if we do have artificially intelligent machines that become super intelligent, at what point should we grant them some form of citizenship, right? Because if you have the case where you have an artificially intelligent machine and it behaves in a way that it wasn't programmed to, and let's say it commits crimes, right? Can we hold that machine accountable in court? What kind of legal ramifications can we have? These are some of these legal questions, but I mean, ultimately they're philosophical questions of when will these artificial intelligence systems become agents, become thinking things that behave on purpose. And unfortunately, the political system, just because of its bureaucratic nature and so forth, tends to be very, very slow when it comes to regulations in terms of, as you mentioned earlier, understanding what artificial intelligence is. You mentioned that as a big priority for you to come to understand this sorts of stuff more and more. But the unfortunate thing with artificial intelligence is that the point at which it becomes a problem, government is very, very slow to respond. And so the sorts of problems we'll be dealing with and the sorts of timescales it takes for solutions to come about, that's the sort of thing that worries me.
Yeah. No, and you bring up a really good point there too, because I mean, when it comes to the government and how it addresses issues as they come up, it's very slow. And I think a lot of times just thinking about who is in government, and typically it's people that don't fully really understand the internet because they didn't grow up with it. I think what's unique about our generation is that we grew up in one way or another with some sort of technology. So we've seen it since we've been little, and every generation after us, they're gonna be, I think, so a bit more dependent in technology than us, because it's just something that's always been a part of life. That hasn't been the case before. So I think that's why it's hard for current legislators to even wrap their minds around what that technology even means, or what it's gonna, or how it's gonna impact things.
Legislators, but also people more generally. It seems that there's a perception, kind of a popular perception that artificial intelligence really is a future problem, but it will be a problem in the future. But I think we're already in that future.
Oh, we 100% are, and again, that's definitely one of the things that I'm wanting to, and that's why I wanted to get into government modernization and tech. And I was like, you know what, I feel like I can bring a good perspective to what's going on in the world of technology, because I'm always just naturally curious to understand these technologies as well. And we might even come up with something like, if something starts becoming autonomous, like in the way it thinks, should we just eradicate it or something? Now that might be an extreme way to do it.
Don't let them hear you.
Yeah, you might have to cut
That's why we're recording on my iPhone.
No, I mean, just thinking laterally, right? Because I think one of the benefits I feel like as being an engineer is I've developed, and because my brother too, he thinks a lot about this because he's also an engineer.
Very interesting.
Lateral, right? Yeah, always laterally thinking. Okay, so like this might be a goal, like, and there's so many, like, all these different solutions that could possibly address the problem or the issue.
And in all fairness to artificial intelligence, we don't know how good things could get if we had an artificial intelligence tool at our disposal. You mentioned earlier the importance of who is in government.
Yeah.
And potentially this could even be something that artificial intelligence, if you had, now for most offices, it doesn't seem likely that an artificial intelligence could take that position, but there are some, for example, people that direct the national, different financial institutions and so forth, that can be done algorithmically and with formulas and so forth. It seems that there are advancements that have been made that can do that, but I personally, I'm skeptical of this possibility of machines replacing specific office, in part just because as human beings, we like knowing there's a person that can be held responsible. We can say that person did their job badly, they should be fired. Whereas if you had a machine doing that, it seems like that aspect of responsibility might not be available.
Oh, big time. And I think the way I see, especially AI in its current form moving forward, is just as a tool. I mean, I know a lot of people, they might use things like ChatGPT and just replace Google. Instead of Googling a question, let me ask this AI this question, because it can just pretty much find all the sources and then put it into a specific response the way I want it. So I think, especially right now, it's definitely more used as a tool. And I've had some conversations actually. So whenever I went to my first legislative national conference, there was also another conference going on in the same city that dealt with data. And I was like, oh, so I sat I sat in the airplane next to a guy that focused on AI specifically within security, some security application. And he mentioned that, we're gonna start using AI to just prevent certain, just to increase cybersecurity, because AI, you can train it to do so many different things. So I think, I don't know, the way he framed it is that we're going to see AI more implemented as an aid. Like you mentioned, it's not just going to be the AI standalone, but it's going to be used to aid a certain function. So maybe in the future, a legislator is going to use a certain AI that's focused more on laws and policies to better inform a decision, I don't doubt that there'll be AIs focused on, what could be like poll facts, like give me like 15 facts over to argue in opposition of a certain bill or in favor of a certain bill, and they can pull, and I don't know, it might be programmed to pull from specific data sources.
Yeah. One potential application along those lines is having machine lawyers and so forth. Right? If it's able to scan through the whole legal history of this country, maybe that would be an efficient way, and perhaps even a cost-effective way.
Yeah. Rather than having a person scan through bucks of law, I mean, you just have an AI that just feed it to the AI and already has it.
And so we've been talking about ChatGPT as one example of this, and one of the things that I'm pleased with is when people raise concerns about artificial intelligence, they use ChatGPT as an example, right? Very practical human concerns, things like plagiarism and cheating and so forth, right? Which I think is a good thing, because it's often very hard to think about AI, especially in terms of what's called the event horizon, or the intelligence explosion, the point at which it's the Frankenstein moment. If it's alive, it's like super thing, right? And nobody knows what's going to happen when that reaches that point. That's why they use the term event horizon, right? Borrowing the analogy from black holes, what happens when you get sucked into the gravitational field. But with these sorts of things, these incremental human problems, right? And that's largely what we've been talking about. I think it's a good thing that people begin to grasp these much more concrete, real problems that are easy to imagine. And so I'm hopeful on that end. But I guess I wonder, among other legislators, do you hear other people thinking about AI, talking about AI?
Not much, actually. Not much at all, actually. Not yet, at least. At least not within the conversations I've had with people here. I brought it up, and I think some legislators do know what ChatGPT is, and do think about AI, but it hasn't been a big thing in conversation yet.
It's unfortunate, but I'm not super surprised that it's not a big topic to talk about. One thing that has been a big topic is TikTok, right? Yeah. Officially, the Oklahoma government has banned it for official use and so forth. So what is your opinion on that?
Yeah, and I can understand why, because I know when it comes to any states-funded areas, they've already kind of restricted the use of TikTok. Like I know at OU, they've restricted it, and here at the Capitol as well. I'm still, I see why. I mean, it's one of those. It could be a concern when it comes to where our data is going. So I definitely understand why they might have implemented that.
So I'm happy to hear you say that, particularly because of your concerns with that's a hard term to use, digital citizenship.
Yes, digital citizenship.
And so one of the concerns with TikTok is specifically its relationship or origin with the Chinese government and so forth. But somebody might raise the concern, well, some of these privacy issues raised by TikTok are also relevant to other apps, things like Facebook and Instagram, these things that have access to our data. And so again, with the kind of future focused perspective in mind, there's a lot of ideas of what can be done to preserve our privacy and so forth. And one particular idea is the idea of data dignity, right? The idea that we ought to be, it ought to be recognized that we own our data, right? And so that to the extent that social media companies sell our data and so forth, perhaps they should do something like with oil companies and so forth, where they pay people for the mineral rights, when they drill under their land and so forth. So what do you think for the future would be a useful way to incorporate this notion of digital citizenship as far as further regulation?
Yeah, no, I think you definitely got a point, because I know with the bill I'm introducing, it's just to better implement digital citizenship within the educational system. To just let people know, hey, your data right now is being used, so you can do this to prevent it from being used, just not prevent it. And other states have found different ways to require apps to have disclosure and have an agreement whether someone can agree or not disagree to share certain types of data. So I know there's certain things already being put into place, but that's actually an idea I haven't thought too much about when it comes to treating it like mineral rights. We have digital rights that are data rights that you could gain some money off of to use your data. So, because right now companies are making a profit in a way, having so much of our data.
Sure. And again, to the ethical concerns, this really places we, the citizens, as the product being bought and sold, right? Since we don't pay for Facebook, we don't pay for these things. Instead, our data is the thing being paid for. And so it gets really complicated in terms of like the ethics and legality of information, right? Because there are really unfortunate examples where like artists, like musicians or whatever, that they suddenly lose the right to their own music or to their own image, their own name, and so forth. So as far as the future of information and how that relates to digital citizenship, what do you think we as citizens should be concerned about, should be thinking about in terms of how our government relates to our informational rights?
Just give me a second, because that's a good question.
Thank you. And perhaps it's something to think about in the future if you have
100%, yeah. So just to make sure I understood the question right, is you're asking what it means for when it comes to the government and our information, like
I guess a different way, a more blunt way to phrase it is, it seems people can be really screwed over in terms of their information by companies. What as citizens, what are some recourse we can have with our government? What kind of protections should we advocate for from our government?
And that's just when it comes to data being used by the government and just by other entities, or both?
Well, I'm assuming both, right? So I'm assuming perhaps the future, considering legislation to protect the data of citizens, or regulate how it's bought and sold in a way that it currently isn't.
No, I think a little bit of both. I mean, I think I, as a citizen, would want my data to be protected. And at least for there be, kind of like with some of the laws that are being passed right now, for there to be my kind of input in there as well. So like, I have a say in how my data is used and whether it's used or not. So I think better reinforcing those kind of regulations, because I think we need to give people the power to control where their data goes and where their data doesn't go. Kind of like the idea of like we should have power over the technology rather than the technologies or the technological companies having power over us. I think that should be the biggest focus and what citizens should really advocate for. Because when it comes to the government is an institution meant to serve people. That's why I think when it comes to the government should be run like a business. I don't really agree with that, because a business is meant for profit. And a lot of people, a lot of companies have profited based off of our data. And I think we need to go back. I know as a government official, I am here to serve my community. So I should really advocate for laws that protect my community when it comes to protecting their data. And I think that's what that means. To protect my community, I have to protect their best interests and inform them hey, this is how your data might be used.
No, that's great.
And I'm glad you brought up these questions, because it really got me thinking a lot about this specific topic, because it's going to be, I think, something that's going to come up more and more as, things like AI will, as the AI develops, is the AI just going to, by default, going to have access to all our data? Is a specific government AI that maybe used in the future going to also have access to certain data? So that's definitely a question I think we need to be thinking about as to how that data, private data, is going to be used both within, just private companies as well as public entities as well.
Sure, yeah. And on that point of private data, this is obviously a big, really hot topic in terms of national politics, right? Both of our presidents, as I mentioned earlier, are under investigation for top secret data, right? And the trouble with the handling of that in both cases. But I hope this will be, something of a first step in terms of you particularly, but hopefully you'll have conversations with other legislators about thinking about data as an object of something that the government should be concerned with, right? So the government is very concerned with things like rights and like property and so forth, but data, but information and how that relates to citizenship. I hope the government will begin to have a more proactive approach to thinking about it.
Oh, big time. Yeah, and because one thing I've thought about is when it comes to data, data is like the new gold in a way. It's like the new kind of oil. And it's valuable for many reasons. So I know that's something, and I appreciate you for asking the questions that you did, because that's one of the things. It showed me that it's an area that I should probably think a lot more about. And I'm glad that, and I think as I think about things like digital citizenship, how, and and what that means within education, but what does that mean when it comes to our rights and the rights we have with our data?
Yeah,
and I think that's really good. That's definitely something I'll be thinking a lot about.
Cool. So by way of closing out, anything else you'd like to say, any shout outs you'd like to give, or any other topics you think are worth mentioning?
Yeah, well, I definitely have to thank you initially for inviting me to speak with you. I think you are a very knowledgeable individual, so I always appreciate our conversations because I know I always learn something. And it definitely helps me better reflect on what I'm doing as a new state representative. Because I know I care, and I'm willing to learn. So I think by having conversations like the one we had today, it gives me a better sense of perspective. But I definitely want to mention that whoever's out there watching, it's important for people to see themselves getting involved in politics and in the government. I'm someone that a year ago I was not thinking about politics. I was not knowledgeable on what was going on politically because I didn't realize how much of an impact it had in my life. Things like the conversation, I think a lot of the conversations we had today, I know they remind me of, when it comes to politics and government, it impacts every aspect of our lives. The ones we realize it impacts and the ones we don't. And it's going to continue to, especially as things like technology develop. So just reminding people that it's important for them to just get involved and at least try to be in the know about who might be your representative, what do they advocate for, and thinking about issues that people really care about. Like, what do you care about as an individual, and what are you willing to advocate for? And I always try to push people, I know from my community, to reach out to me if there's anything that comes up with them, whether it be like their stance on an issue or even an idea they might have. Like, hey, I don't know, our state's doing this, but should we do it? Should we not? Because it was because of constituent requests and conversations with my constituents that I've been able to really develop my platform.
Fantastic. Well, Arturo Alonso, thank you very much for
Thank
joining.
you.
Appreciate it, sir.